Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our November Talks on Tuesday. Today, we're going to be talking about Gestalt language processing. What's the buzz? I am Corey Hill from the Partnership for People with Disabilities at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I oversee Virginia's Early Intervention Professional Development Center. I am going to take the opportunity to thank our three presenters, Corey, Kathleen, and Christy. They will be introducing themselves, and we are eager. We have lots to cover. We are eager to get started. So I'm going to turn this over first to Corey to introduce herself. Thanks, everybody.
Hello, everybody. I am trying to, there we go. There we are. I'm making sure that my slides are working, but I'm so thrilled to be here today. I'm Corey Cassidy, and I am a professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at Radford University. I've been here in Radford in particular for almost 18 years and have made my rounds in the state of Virginia over the years before that as well. I have a focus as far as my teaching, my research, and my clinical work on birth to five services and interprofessional practice with a particular passion in early intervention. I have served young children and families as a speech language pathologist for more than 27 years now and really enjoy learning new information and as a seasoned SLP, recognizing the cycles of knowledge and ensuring that we are engaging in evidence-based practice, particularly in early intervention and early childhood. I'm going to hand it over to Kathleen to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kathleen Wright. I'm a coordinator of early childhood special education at the Training and Technical Assistance Center at Virginia Tech, so TTAC at Virginia Tech. And prior to joining TTAC, I was a speech language pathologist in the public schools in Virginia for over 27 years, and I've worked with children from 2 up through 22 years old with speech and language disorders. And right now, my focus is on providing high quality, inclusive learning environments for young children, and we really work on supporting language and communication skills, early literacy, play, and social emotional development, and do a lot of work with embedding the use of augmentative and alternative communication and assistive technology in the early childhood classroom. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk about Gestalt language with all of you. And then I'm going to pass it on to Christy.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christy Hill, and I am another speech language pathologist. You have three of us today. I started my career actually in some private settings, and I worked within those private settings at some Head Starts and also some hospitals. And we did a lot of work with early intervention. So we provided PT, OT, and speech. So I spent a lot of times in homes working with occupational therapists and physical therapists and families. And then I stayed home for a little bit to raise some babies. And then I returned to the profession in the Virginia public schools and was a speech language pathologist for many years before now joining about a year and a half ago, Virginia Tech TTAC, the Training and Technical Assistance Center that Kathleen mentioned. And so we are so happy to have you all here. We appreciate you spending an hour with us. And we really want to spend and start our day looking at a picture. Let's see if mine will move. There we go. So let's see, look at this picture. What do you see when you look at this picture? And we're going to ask you to put in the chat what you see in this picture. And Corey and Kathleen, if I can't read them all and you see some words, please just shout them out if I'm not fast enough. So please add in the chat, what do you see in this picture?
I see lots of responses already, Christy.
Yes,
Boats and docks and water and mountains and
I love it. Yes, and this is exactly what we were talking about. Water, village, harbor, mountains, boats, water, communication tower, peaceful. This is exactly what we wanted to hear today because some of these answers are kind of more big picture answers. And some of these, and you looked at some small parts of the picture. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. We want you to keep those answers in mind as we discuss some different words on our next slide. So the way that each of us processes information is individualized, including how we process and develop language. So the two styles we are really going to address today focus on how children process and acquire language. One of those is analytical language processing, where this is a more single, predictable, linear progression. Some of those of you who said boat, they might fit in this analytical language processing category. The other we're going to talk about is Gestalt language processing, where this is where children are developing language in chunks. So some of you that saw the bigger picture, the marina, the harbor, were more in this category of Gestalt language processors. We want to make a note of one term here, natural language acquisition, or NLA. This is a detailed description of Gestalt language development, and it's supported by the clinical research of Marge Blanc and her colleagues in 2012. And it was founded on the pioneering work of Ann Peters and Barry Prezant. So NLA describes the logical, natural developmental process of Gestalt language development, and it provides a roadmap for supporting children in natural, conversational, developmentally appropriate ways. Now, you're going to see and hear this term often in literature and discussions around GLP, so we wanted to make mention of it here so that you would know when you saw that what it meant. We want you to keep in mind that we don't typically use all analytical or all Gestalt processing, but rather a blend of the two. And some people may rely more heavily on one than the other. But the idea is that we need both routes to explain typical language acquisition. And both of these represent very normal language developmental progressions. Each of these should be considered as we're working with children with assessment and intervention. Now, in a moment, Corey is going to really go into a deep dive about GLP and ALP. But at this precise moment, how do you feel about your knowledge about Gestalt language processing? You see the scale at the bottom of the slide, and with 1 being that you are very unfamiliar, you've never heard these words before, all the way to 10 being you are intimately familiar with this topic. You know a lot about this. If you want to use your star feature, kind of tell us on this scale from 1 to 10, how familiar are you at this moment with Gestalt language processing? We'll give you a minute to kind of show some of that. If you're perfect, I see some people writing in the chat too, 8s and 5s, 8 to 9, 3, 2, 6, 8. And this is exactly what we hoped for and expected as well. We love that we're seeing numbers from the bottom to the top. And our hope will be if you chose 1 or 2 or 3, maybe by the end of this hour, you will kind of go up a little bit on the scale. And if you are a 9 or a 10, we hope that we kind of are solidifying our knowledge with you today. So Corey, I'm going to hand it over to you to really talk more about these concepts.
Absolutely, Christy. Yeah, I think it's really exciting and interesting that some of you have significant knowledge and some of you are brand new to this. And again, even though you have 3 speech language pathologists talking with you today, this webinar, this information we're sharing is really for everyone, from family members, from caregivers, to providers, and even specialists. So we're going to start talking a little bit more about analytical language processing, or ALP. This is considered, as Christy had said, the natural or traditional way, what we used to always think most children process and develop language. So ALP is the foundation for how most current assessments are organized, how we have traditionally written goals and objectives, and how we have addressed and provided intervention for young children with language delays and disorders across time. Analytic language processing is considered a bottom-up approach to language development, and as such, language follows along the path from cooing to babbling to single words. Those single words turn into 2-word combinations and phrases, and all the way up through beginning conversation. So our focus tends toward the development of vocabulary from concrete words to abstract constructs, grammatical structures, the expression of utterances by increasing the complexity of language sequentially over time. As the child grows, so does their language develop. Ultimately, analytical language processing follows a path of language development where a child learns single words followed by two-word phrases, eventually leading to multi-word sentences. So, for example, a child who processes and develops language along this path may first learn and express the word apple. Once they begin to expand their vocabulary and combine two words together, they will learn and verbalize eat apple. And eventually, they may learn to use pronouns and articles, embed phrases, and conjoin clauses, and they may say, I want to eat the apple. Now let's address Gestalt language processing, which is essentially the star of this presentation. So Gestalt language processing, or GLP, has recently become quite a trending topic in the world of speech-language pathology. But really, what is it, and what do we need to know to provide responsive evidence-based practices to the children and family we serve? So Gestalt language processing is considered a top-down approach to language development. With this in mind, I just want to take a moment and talk about echolalia. Christy mentioned chunks of language. And when we talk about a Gestalt, we're talking about a chunk of language that's heard, stored, and used. Echolalia, as many of you may know, is the repeating or echoing of what another person has said. So children, especially those with whom we've worked who are echolalic, imitate what they've heard someone say in everyday life, or lines they've listened to or heard from a book, lyrics to a song, or a script from a show, a television show, or a movie. Echolalia can also include not only the words spoken, but often the exact imitation of a person's inflection, their tone of voice, and even their volume. So those of us who work with young children most often characterize children as echolalic when many of the words or phrases a child uses seems to be comprised of repetitions from a previous activity rather than new or novel utterances they come up with on their own. So essentially, when we're talking about Gestalt language processing and Gestalt language development, these are two terms that both refer to a style of language acquisition that begins with these larger, often echoed chunks of language. While ALP is defined by the systematic growth that begins with single words and progresses to multi-word utterances, GLP is defined by the evolution of more rigid language chunks into more flexible multi-word utterances. Gestalt language processors often use language rich in intonation, meaning their pitch and the sing-song support of their speech may vary greatly. Those processing language this way may also include those infants and toddlers then who are attracted to pitch, intonation, and music more than sounds and words. And this is because we believe they primarily hear those prosodic features of language, the melody of speech, rather than the speech sounds themselves. So an example of a Gestalt language processor includes the child who first verbalizes or sings "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" repeatedly. This line from the song eventually gets broken down to the sentence, "I see a little star," to the eventual labeling of star. And over time, the child may express, "Let's sing a song." So using those greater chunks or those echolalic utterances and turning those into more novel opportunities to communicate. So I'm so excited to take a few minutes to hear from one of our own in the world of early intervention. Talisha Woodfin is with us today. And Talisha has a 10-year-old son, Elijah, who is autistic and a great example of a child who has developed his language through the use of Gestalts and Gestalt language processing. Talisha, would you share your story with us?
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for having me today. So Elijah in this picture, Elijah is probably about 2 years old. He's about 2 years old in this picture, and still did not have a lot of language. At this time, we're at the park and we did a lot of things that you do with typical 2-year-olds and really tried to use those opportunities as opportunities for us to share language with him. So a little bit of background. So my name is Talisha Woodfin, as was stated. I am a monitoring consultant with the Infant and Toddler Connection of Virginia. My educational background is in social work. I've been in early intervention locally as well as the state level for it's 2014 now. So almost 15 years. And so I was not a newbie when Elijah came along. I really understood child development and what things should look like for him. I'm also the mother of 3, so Elijah is the youngest. I have a daughter through kinship care. She's 25, a son that is 20, and then Elijah. So for you guys that have more than one child, you know that your youngest child pretty much how they learn is a little bit different than the older ones because they have a lot of the older ones to kind of look up to. And so a lot of that was kind of what I was contributing to what we were seeing with Elijah in his language development. So Elijah, when I took him to his 2-year-old appointment, we did the MChat, which many doctors do. Um, Elijah had a lot of words. And if you remember the questions that are asked on the MChat, it asks you about the number of words that a child has. Well, Elijah had a lot of words because Elijah would repeat anything that we said. But Elijah was not using any of those words outside of repeating what we were saying. So he was not stringing those words together, using them to communicate with us or anything like that. He would just, if we said something, he would repeat it. And that might be the only time we ever heard it. And so I knew as a early interventionist that burst of language comes around 18 months typically, but that definitely by 2 years, if I wasn't hearing that, we definitely needed to make some transitions and get some support. So he did get early intervention services as well as private speech and OT to support him during that time. So Elijah, I told you that he was pretty much just repeating. Well, when Elijah started therapy, we started to hear him repeat. I didn't even acknowledge it as echolalia at that time because of what he was repeating. Elijah was obsessed with cars, as many children on the spectrum are, obsessed with cars, and we watched Cars the movie a lot. And there was a specific phrase from Cars the movie, the first one, that he would always say, "I don't want your help. I don't need your help." And trust me, I'm not doing the phrase any justice because Elijah could say it exactly like Lightning McQueen would say it. And you might turn around and think that Lightning was in the room with us. But we had little phrases like that Elijah would use. And sometimes he would use them in contexts where it was appropriate, right? Sometimes it would be in instances where we were actually trying to help Elijah and he would use that phrase. And so the phrase would make sense. But there would be other times where he might be playing with his cars and he might be repeating it because he's like reliving the story from Cars. And there are other times when it just did not make any sense at all to us why he was using that. And that's just one of many phrases that he had that came from movies or came from songs or came from things that maybe he heard us say a lot. And that was really how we heard his language start to evolve. Elijah is 10 now. And for those of you who were at Creating Connections, you may have actually got a chance to meet Elijah. His language now has really evolved significantly, but we continue to hear little things from time to time that just remind us of the progression of language. Right now, even though we don't allow social media for him at 10 years old, he does have a 20-year-old brother. And so right now there is this musical trend on Instagram or TikTok, I believe, that says, "Oh my gosh." And it's in a sing-songy voice. And so Elijah has picked that up. And that is one of the things that he does now that we continue to hear him kind of use over and over again. Also, he picks little phrases from commercials. Another thing that took us a minute to understand was happy tastes good. Anybody know what happy tastes good is? It's Dairy Queen. He never says it's Dairy Queen. He always refers it as happy tastes good because that is what they say at the end of the commercial on the show. So while Elijah is reading now, he is an avid reader and loves to read, and his communication has gotten much better. We do see pieces of that social communication, that deficit in social communication pop up a little bit more as he continues to get older. And also we continue to hear some of that scripted language that I mentioned. So when I learned about Gestalt, I was like, oh my gosh, that's my baby. Elijah is 10. He will be 11 in March. Katie, I saw your note in there. Is there anything else you guys wanted me to share about Elijah?
No, Talisha, thank you so much. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions for you, and we'll keep an eye on those. But I really want to thank you for sharing Elijah's journey with us and providing us with such a great example of what it might look like for a young child and a child growing up to communicate with, learn from, and support the language development, who is a Gestalt language processor. And it sounds like Elijah is, to a certain extent at least, right? So to review then, before we move forward, how might we compare the two forms of language processing now that we have a better picture of what we're considering? The truth is that both styles of language development are considered typical. They both lead to original, complex, self-generated language. The difference is how children present early language and the path they take to develop language over time. So while analytical language processing begins with sounds and single words and follows a path from simple to complex, Gestalt language processing begins with whole phrases or songs or even lines from stories and movies or Dairy Queen commercials that are echoed by the child, often frequently and repetitively across contexts, but certainly with intention and or with the intention to communicate early on. And so language then develops with Gestalt language processors from whole chunks to smaller chunks, and eventually their echolalic use of language develops into phrases and sentences. So Kathleen and Christy are now going to take a deeper dive into Gestalt language processing and provide us with information about the who, what, and how.
Okay, so it says, what gestalts do children typically learn? And have you ever heard this question, what gestalts do I need to focus on? And and this is something that we hear often, like, what should we focus on? But it's a confusing question because, as Talisha demonstrated for us, the gestalts or the chunks of language that children use are individualized. It's based on what sparks meaning to them, what sparks interest to them. So it's based on the setting they're in, their experiences, maybe what that meaning might speak to them that it might not mean the same thing to us, but that could mean really something to them. So we have to be detectives and try to help to figure out that meaning. But those, we can't sit there and say, okay, we're going to focus on these gestalts because each gestalt that children use, it is so individualized for each child. It's based on their interests and their experiences and what they find that conveys meaning to them. So when we think about what is the typical path that they learn, it really depends on the child. There is no typical path. It's based on what they attribute meaning to in those chunks of language that speak to them. So like I said, we really need to be a detective sometimes, like Talisha said. Sometimes her son used that phrase from Cars that they could easily tell what he meant by it, but sometimes they didn't understand where he was, what that meaning was. So we really have to be detectives to really think about, to really kind of tune into what they're saying and why they may be using that at that time. And one other thing about gestalts is that a child may use one gestalt in different settings, and it could mean different things in each setting. So that's why we really need to tune into them and really understand their intended message, because we don't want to put words into someone's mouth. We want to make sure that we are understanding what they're trying to communicate to us, because if we put words into their mouth, that's only going to be frustration for everybody involved. So many times, as Corey had talked about earlier, the gestalts are lines from songs or books or movies or shows, or even just like sounds and melodies that they've heard in a setting. So whatever that child is familiar with is what they're going to use. And we're going to dig into this more as we move through our slides. Oop. Yeah. So who are Gestalt language processors? And we've talked about this a little bit so far, but let's just take a minute to think about this and consider this. Have you ever experienced processing language in this way, where you processed something that was said as a chunk or a whole? And think about that. And as you think about that, you can add in the chat maybe when this has happened to you. I'm going to share a story that just happened to me recently. I was talking to my niece who recently just got a job, and she said she was working at the C&O Canal. And I was like, goodness, I've never heard of the C&O Canal. And I was not sure what she was talking about or where she was. My husband seemed to understand what she was talking about, but I had no idea what she was talking about. But I listened to her new job and I, heard about what she was doing. but I really still did not know where the C&O Canal was. But then, as we were up in Pennsylvania at the time, as we were driving home from Pennsylvania back to Virginia, I saw a sign that said C and O. So the letter C and the letter O, canal. And then it hit me that it wasn't C and O in one chunk of language, but it was C and O. So it took me some time. I got confused. I wasn't sure how to keep up with that conversation because I was processing that as a gestalt or a chunk of language and not hearing all those the parts of that language. We often see that in young children with the alphabet song where elemento is one letter and it's not, they don't hear those different pieces of the letter. So I see some people are sharing in the chat some things they have done. Learning a second language. Yes, that always is something where you hear it all as one piece. Yep. When I was there, I thought Elvis Presley saying, a mushka instead of I'm all shook up. Oh yeah, so you often hear that in songs. There's always songs that we get the lyrics wrong because we're processing that as a chunk. That's what comes to us. So we're processing that as a chunk. So those are some good examples. So when we think about it, we are all Gestalt language processors like Christy had touched on earlier. So here we go.
What?
Everyone. So we've already put that up there about sharing our experience of processing language that way. If anyone ever has other ones, let's see. When I first moved to Lexington, I heard people say W and L, and I thought it was, yep, that's the same sort of thing. When you're not familiar with something, you process it in what you know, so you bring it back to that meaning. Yep. So we all have those times where we've processed language in a chunk like that. So we don't want to say it's one set of people or another. It's that we all process that and we use both of those types of processing of language. So when we have Gestalt language processors, some things we might observe, and Corey touched on this a little bit earlier, with lots of intonation and prosody. So intonation is that rising and falling of pitch, and prosody is those patterns and the stress and the intonation. And it's like Talisha said with her son, he repeated that line from Cars, but he repeated it exactly as exactly with the correct intonation and prosody that none of us could probably repeat as well as he could. So children that often are Gestalt language processors, they really tune into that intonation and prosody, and that provides a lot of meaning for them. The delayed echolalia, which we say for lines from songs and movies and books, that we're going to hear those, the repetition of words and phrases after a delay of a period of time, and they're going to be used to help them communicate meaning. So something that I've heard with one of my students is every time it was snack time, if there was something sweet, she would say, I want to taste the rainbow from the Skittles ad, because she wanted something sweet. So she would let us know that she was excited about getting her sweets. So that's something that helped her communicate to let us know, yep, she was wanting her snack and she wanted something sweet for her snack. Another thing that we often see with Gestalt language processors is jargon-like language. So often it sounds like a lot of nonsense sounds and words just kind of connected together with a lot of intonation and prosody, but that jargon and that connection of those sounds and words provides a lot of meaning for that child to communicate to us. So again, we have to listen real closely so that maybe in that jargon that we're hearing with that connection of those sounds and intonation, we might realize, oh, that's their favorite song that they like, or that's maybe something from a movie. So we need to really make sure that we have good listening ears on, and we really want to tune into what the child is telling us. And then one thing that we often see is replaying a part of a song or a movie over and over again. For those children that have a favorite part, like on a CD or even in a movie, they'll rewind it just those few seconds so they can hear that same part over and over and over again. I had several children that had, some of those musical toys where they would just push the same pattern and buttons over and over again because they like the way that sound. So that's also an indication of someone who is a Gestalt language processor, that they want to hear something over and over again. So as we talked about the intonation, the jargon, the delayed echolalia, the repetition of parts of a song, we would like to take a minute just to share in the chat if you have ever observed any of these characteristics in a client or family member that you have worked with.
And Kathleen, while people are sharing some of their stories, I do want to note, I don't know if I'm saying your name right, Gory, perhaps? It sounds like we all use some forms of processing, but some of us favor one over the other. And I think you just nailed that on the head. That's exactly what we're saying. So thank you for clarifying that even in chat. I love that you've picked up on that. And Talisha, thank you for sharing that you've observed all of these with Elijah. So we're confirming what you've been sharing with us. And now back to our story.
Yeah.
Isn't that like a soap opera, right?
We heard that a lot. And yeah, I do appreciate pointing out that some people are primarily learn this way, or maybe they rely on the Gestalt language processing more than others, but we all have a mix of it in there. The songs from Disney movies, that's a big thing. The songs and the melodies really seem to connect with a Gestalt language processor, so they really like to repeat that. And then replaying one clip over and over again, yeah. So a lot of you have experienced this with some of the children that you have interacted with. I've heard
And I see one other note, Kathleen, because I know you're going to touch on this in a few minutes. Several of you have noted children who are on the autism spectrum. And certainly we see a lot of echolalia with those children in particular. And Kathleen's going to talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. I think we're handing it back to Christy, but then Kathleen will touch on that as well, for sure. So thank you for sharing those.
Oh, and then the Miss Rachel songs and phrases, says I know Miss Rachel's a big popular person right now, so a lot of that is repeated. Yep. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Christy now.
Okay, yes, we want to spend just a few minutes of our time today discussing the 6 stages a Gestalt language processor may go through. So you may kind of think about some of those children that you were just talking about and see if they went through these stages or where they are now. The first stage would be delayed echolalia. And this is what we were just talking about, where repeating words and phrases after a time delay. So maybe they are processing of language gestalts heard in one situation and then used later to communicate in another situation. This is when they are developing verbal language in those chunks that we talked about. And through this echolalia or delayed echolalia, like Corey and Kathleen said, kind of imitating those whole phrases from songs, maybe something a parent or a family member says a lot, or favorite shows, and they are viewing those as one single unit of meaning, one chunk. So an example might be, good night, sleep tight. And they view that as one chunk, not 4 different words. And they may have heard that somewhere, and it may mean good night, sleep tight, or it could mean something totally different. And again, as we've alluded to, you kind of have to put your detective eyes and ears on to figure out what that means in certain situations for a child, and if it means something different in different situations. The next stage is the mix and match stage, and this is where you'll see some partial gestalts. These are when the gestalts are mitigated. They're kind of broken down into smaller pieces, smaller words that will then be mixed and matched to form new utterances. So an example might be they took the good night from that delayed echolalia chunk of good night, sleep tight, and then added it's bedtime. Good night, it's bedtime. And maybe they heard that somewhere else. Stage 3, when we move into that, is single words and 2-word combinations. This is when single words are isolated as a unit of meaning and then used in novel 2-word combinations, generating really original 2 or more word phrases. Now, in this stage, we're going to see that many words are being combined in the same ways that the analytical processors would be creating 2-word phrases, such as go sleep. Stages 4 through 6 are often lumped together, and we're going to do that today with you all. And this is when we see new original phrases happening with really some basic to very advanced grammar. Stage 4 is often noted as the bad grammar stage. And this is when children are creating new sentences and phrases, but there really isn't any good grammar happening. And then stages 5 and 6 is when you're going to see some use of more complex grammar. At these stages 4 through 6, this is again when the GLPs and analytical language processors are developing much in the same way, where they're beginning to put words together, not have some great grammar, and then coming to have some more advanced grammar abilities. An example of that might be, I'm tired, I'll go to sleep. Now, typically, speech therapy with Gestalt language processors is very child-led and centered around the child's unique interests. And SLPs that work with Gestalt language processors put emphasis on modeling those phrases that can be easily recombined so they can move through these stages. Phrases such as let's go or it's time to, so that you can mix and match and put other words with that so that the student, the child, is working through all of that. Speech therapists also acknowledge all gestalts and scripting that we've talked about, and we try to use those context clues to figure out what in the world the underlying communicative purpose is of the gestalt. So those are the 6 stages that you may see as some of your students are moving through this ability to process and learn language. Now, next, Kathleen's going to really kind of dive deep into some more research and evidence-based practice around Gestalt language processing.
Kathleen, is your screen moving?
Okay, I could not do anything. I could not unmute, but now I can.
There you go.
I don't know what happened, but I was locked up. So sorry about that.
No
So
worries.
we're going to talk a little bit about what the research tells us. So we really want to focus on that evidence-based practice. So we're using the EBP triangle that from ASHA, and we're going to look at the 3 sides of the triangle so that we can make some sense out of what the research and what information is telling us about Gestalt language processing. And the first thing we're going to talk about is those client perspectives. And the great thing about this is that it's very neurodiversity affirming, so that we now have information from older neurodivergent learners who can share their experiences in learning this way. So we are considering the GLP supports those neurodivergent learners and understanding that there is not a right way and a wrong way to learn language, but that language learning may occur in different ways. But the same end goal is that we want meaningful and flexible communication. So if we're learning it in Gestalt chunks, we want to make sure that we can break those chunks down so that we can have that meaningful and flexible communication. Like somebody in the chat had said, you know, when they're using those chunks in different settings, they're overgeneralizing because they haven't learned how to break those chunks down to make that flexible language. But this this information that we're getting is really showing us that we don't need to fix that person, but we need to make them look more neurotypical, that we need to embrace how they're learning. And the big thing that this has taught us all, and the information that is presented, is that echolalia is approached more through functionally through GLP principles. It describes the people's own learning experience, and that we know that we have to embrace echolalia and not try to extinguish it. Years and years and years ago, the goal was that echolalia was a behavior, an interfering behavior, because they repeated things. And we didn't tune into that child and say, no, they're really trying to communicate something to us, and we're ignoring that, and that's why the behavior is occurring. So one of the big things that we're understanding is that echolalia is a great way to communicate, to start that communication, and so that we need to figure out what it's meaning and help build on that echolalia as opposed to extinguishing it. So really understanding the differences in language processing. The other thing when we think about evidence-based practices is the clinical expertise. And much of the information that we get about GLPs, it comes from clinical experiences of those working with autistic individuals. And I think Christy mentioned that Marge Blanc has done much work, and she's shared a lot of information that she's gathered through samples of clients progressing through the stages over time. And much of this information is shared through books and through longitudinal studies, but not through peer-reviewed publications. So a lot of it is just based on experience with working with clients with neurodivergent clients. And the last thing we look at is what sorts of external and internal evidence that we have to support this. And the thing is that it's hard to get real quantitative data because there's a lot of barriers in providing getting language samples because it's not an exact science when you're working with a child that has echolalia to get a language sample, because like we said, that chunk of language can mean a lot of different things. So some scripts are real easy to identify as what they mean, like the meaning of blast off might mean let's go, or I'm ready, I'm done. And that might be easy to interpret, but some other of those little chunks of language that they use in different settings may be harder for us to interpret, even for someone who's very familiar with the child. So there is still a lot of work that needs to be done in this area in order to really get some good peer-reviewed information. And what we're really doing now with the evidence is just relying on expert opinion and the clinical experience of people that have worked with Gestalt language processors. So as we sum up the research, it's given us great insight with that first-hand account of language development that align with the GLP. And again, we know that echolalia serves many communicative functions and that we need to embrace that. We know that scripting is a valid and important form of communication for some autistic individuals. And we have a lot of great insight from those from clinical experiences working with GLPs, but we need to continue to get more information regarding that quantitative data so that we compare treatment options. So we can say, what treatment method is really going to be the one that helps with that student. Okay. So with all of this information that we have, we need to make sure that, like Corey said earlier, we are seeing that GLP is showing up everywhere, and we need to make sure that we are providing facts and good information to the clients that we're working with. So we want to make sure that we avoid assumptions. And our first thing that we have to keep in mind is that there's no clear criteria for designating someone as a Gestalt language processor. So we need to consider if it even makes sense to say someone is a Gestalt language processor or an analytical processor, because what have we talked about throughout our whole session today is that we all use both ways of processing. So we need to make sure that we're not putting people in a certain box and having certain expectations. We need to realize that Gestalt language processing is a framework. It's not a diagnosis, or it's not a program to follow. Those stages that Christy shared with us are great descriptions, and it helps describe those learning experiences of neurodivergent individuals, but it's not a diagnosis that we're going to get. And then, of course, we need to watch out for those quick fixes, that if we start going through these stages, that's going to be the way to make language happen quickly. We need to not oversimplify things. We don't want to say that all children with autism or neurodivergent learners are Gestalt language processors, because that's not always the way. So we need to make sure that we're not putting everything into putting things into different boxes and overgeneralizing things. And because we really need to remember, and I think we all do this, is that we need to consider each child as an individual and what makes sense for that child. So we're going to just take a minute here. We've talked about a lot of different things. We've had a lot of great information in the chat. I'm going to see if I can pull my chat back up, because when my screen locked up, I lost my chat. But when we sit here, let's take a minute to reflect on what we've talked about so far, and maybe what's something you have learned, or what's something that has changed your thinking about Gestalt language processing. And if you could share that in the chat, we would love to hear about that. if anybody had any aha moments as they've been listening to us talk this last little bit. You appreciate the ASHA framework. It really does help put things into perspective. Yeah, it's
So
not
Carmela is asking the EBP. EBP stands for evidence-based practice. And of course, Kathleen was talking about the American Speech Language Hearing Association framework. So as SLPs, we really like to refer back to the ASHA foundations that we're provided with. And they have a really nice framework and foundation in that visual of a triangle, that there are three different areas primarily that we look at when we're talking about evidence-based practice.
Thank you, Corey.
Sure.
And I think there are a lot of people are putting in the chat that, well, the stages have been helpful. And I think that we need to, a lot of people are saying that it's not a diagnosis, that it's just a way to describe learning, and that we need to keep that in mind. So I think that's a really good thing. And
well, we want folks to keep sharing your thoughts. What have you learned? What has changed in your thinking? What has really stood out for you? What were your aha moments? And while you continue to do that, we're going to go ahead and move forward and talk further just the last little bit about where do we go from here. So you've learned a lot of information. We're seeing a lot of things on the chat that have been that we're so thrilled to see. You've been enlightened, you've got some clarity, you understand some new pieces and components, and definitely that there's a lot of overlap for all of us as language learners and how we develop. So let's talk about some of the strategies and the things that we might do with our families and our children to support language development, regardless of how they're learning and how they're developing their language and their ability to communicate. And we'll keep an eye on questions as they come up as well. So although many of the unique intervention strategies that are currently associated with Gestalt language processing lack theoretical rationale and empirical evidence, as Kathleen said, it does remain true that we as speech language pathologists in our field and everybody in every field should continue to embrace general good evidence-based practices. And these strategies include recognizing echolalia as communicative and as intentional attempts to communicate with others, acknowledging and responding to all communication attempts, following the child's lead, and partnering with families. And we do know that the research suggests that many individuals develop language using these combinations of the two styles. Ultimately, language development may just simply not be as clear-cut as we previously believed. And so as we think about those things and truly become the detective that Kathleen mentioned earlier, we need to think about what some of the evidence-based strategies are then, right? If we now have some of the evidence and the foundations, what are the strategies? So what I'd like to do is review a few of the strongest evidence-based strategies for working with young children and their families, regardless of the way or ways in which the child processes and learns language. So first, we must work with the family to find interests that are specific to each child. So we need to investigate. We need to come up with a plan to collect information related to the child's interests. And Gori noted that we need to figure out whether the gestalts they're sharing or the language or the words that they're using are in context and what those contexts are. So learning more about the child's interests promote and support their participation. And participation and experience promotes mastery of language. So if the child likes a toy or an activity or a video or a commercial, they'll learn more about it. They will choose to do so, and we can jump on board with that. Once we identify a focus in which a child is engaged and invested, we need to work with the family to increase both the breadth and the depth for that interest. We also know engaging in family-centered practices in the natural environment of any child is going to have the greatest impact on the child, no matter how they process and develop language. And family-centered practice, of course, is based on the belief that the best way to meet children's needs is within their families and to engage in services that both involve, strengthen, and even support these families. And so when we implement these practices, we build on the strengths of the family and meet their changing needs. And the evidence, of course, supports our use of both general and specific play, turn-taking, and language support strategies with young children for positive and significant effects on their social communication, their play, and ultimately their language and communication development. And then, of course, coaching the family to build their capacity. So we need to meet each family where they are. We need to determine what their priorities are and work on their skills within activities and routines that are of interest and are familiar and comfortable to the parents and caregivers, and then strengthen the self-efficacy and well-being of parents and caregivers as these positive outcomes lead to informed family choices and decision-making. right? And we know that coaching is not just about checking in, but it's really digging in, becoming the detective that the family needs for us to support their processing, their language learning, their engagement with their child, and ultimately their success as a family. So, in keeping that in mind, a few of you actually noted this earlier, and then as you respond, I'm going to look at some of these questions up here. But what are some questions when we're serving as those detectives? What are some of the questions we might ask parents or caregivers when we're trying to figure out the meaning behind their child's echolalia? Kay Tish, I don't know what your name is, but Kay Tish mentioned that they were working with a child who kept saying, "What the heck?" And what the heck? And the mom didn't know where that came from, but it was used in multiple contexts. My kids used to say, "What the what?" From the Lego movie all the time. And it was often when they needed clarification or they didn't like what they were doing or they wanted to do something different. But then Corey Hill jumped on and said, "I think this is coming from Bluey." So we're already doing some of the detective work with each other, but those are the kinds of things we can be asking the parents and caregivers. So yes, as Corey said, all of this is hopefully what we're doing as early interventionists, as service providers. So are there any questions you can think of that we might be able to use or ask the parents as we're trying to figure out the meaning? What are some questions that we could ask when we're trying to get to the bottom line of what the child needs and how they're communicating? When do you hear it? What are their favorite songs and books? What is important? Where and what context have you heard it? What are your thoughts on what the child means when they say this, right? So these are great questions, just diving deeply into what's happening with the child, what's the routine or the location or the experience that they're engaged in. These are great questions. You're all on the right path. All good, solid detectives work happening here. So the bottom line is to ask the questions, consider the meaning by diving into the context and finding the source of the gestalt or the echolalia, help the family connect the dots, and ultimately work as those detectives. So I know that there was a question, and before I jump into the next little segment, I want to take a look at that question. It was about oh my goodness, where did I find it now? It was a concern about, yes, about Gestalt language processing not being considered atypical language learning because local school divisions will use this to not find the kiddos eligible for Part B services. I think what I would say is that we need to look as SL, you need to work with your speech language pathologists and your other service providers and determine how effectively the child is communicating. So it's not so much, and I'm going to ask if Christy and Kathleen want to add to any of this. It's not so much that they're learning language in an atypical way, but are they using language to communicate effectively? And often when children are using chunks or echolalia or gestalts, they still need our support to help them be effective in the communication, right? In the use, in the pragmatics, and even in the semantics that might be limited, or the complexities and how they can use some syntax and morphology, the grammar of language on a unique level and shift those things around to get their message across. Christy, I don't know if you want to add to that before I move forward.
Yeah, I was going to say one of our takeaways in a few moments is going to be that exactly what you just said, that Gestalt language development is a natural process of learning, and neither analytical language processing or Gestalt language processing is right or wrong. They're just different. But exactly what you all just said, you would say no matter what type of language processor a child is, if they're not functionally communicating or if they need some assistance moving through stages either way, they would still qualify for therapy services to assist with that, no matter what type of language processor they are.
Thank you, Christy. And Corey reminds us that, and Christy's going to remind us as well into the takeaways that GLP is not a diagnosis. So we wouldn't put in an IEP or the assessment piece that, oh, this is how they learn language, therefore they have a language disorder. The two don't go together in that way. And how a child learns in language is not measured on assessment, right? It's the outcomes, it's the developmental milestones. And so even using a type token ratio or something where we look at how broad and how deep are they using the language is much more important than the way in which they're learning it. So I want to take a few minutes. Oh, now I've got to get the slide to move. Let's see if I can do this. Oh, there we go. I want to take a few minutes to just share our secrets. And, when I work with my undergraduate and graduate students, I've been teaching for a long time. And I work with students who are going to be my colleagues in a very few short years. And I tell them that if we are providing solid, engaging, responsive services to our families, we're also sharing our secrets, right? I'm teaching them to then have that ripple effect to teach everyone else. And I say that, recognizing that the things that I'm going to talk about in just for about 2 minutes, I'm going to make it really quick as we're running down low on time, is that these really aren't secrets, right? But as we get this information, we should be sharing it with the people with whom we're working, with the families, with the other service providers, just like we are now. What does this mean and how do we address it? So the first thing to keep in mind is that we need to connect with families and children by building positive relationships, by providing those strategies, by talking about the modeling, the prompting, the cueing, and within the context of coaching. We really need to encourage the collaboration with the families, that we're trying to work through this together and figure out how to best support their children. Next, we want to make sure that we offer practical strategies and resources that are tailored to this family's strengths and priorities, as well as the child's communication needs, and the way in which they're developing language, regardless of what that might look like. We also need to be good and effective communication partners by acknowledging and coaching families to acknowledge all communication attempts. And Kathleen talked a little bit about this as well, that no matter how the child is communicating, if it is an intentional use of language in any way, we want to respond. We want to make sure that we're acknowledging their nonverbal cues, their gestures, their facial expressions, their body language, and then even the sounds and words and imitations and echolalia that they may be using. And then finally, we want to recognize that self-regulation is the ability to understand and manage our own behaviors and our own reactions. And in young children, the development of self-regulation supports their learning, their behaviors, and their ability to get along well with others. And self-regulation begins to develop rapidly when children are in the toddler and preschool years. And strategies that we can come up with as SLPs, with our OTs, with our other service providers, with our case managers, are able to really help young children learn to manage their emotions and behaviors in different situations, and how to encourage and support and embed those strategies in our work with families. So you are welcome to share some examples of ways that you've successfully connected with families, the secrets that you have that you would like to share with us. And while you do that, I'm going to hand it over to Christy to go ahead and share our takeaways as we wrap up our really short amount of time with you for today.
Well, it'll only take me a second because I'm so proud that so many of you have already shared in the chat some of the takeaways that we wanted to make sure you had. I did see a chat about MLU and how there's going to be a lot of our Gestalt language processors that they were concerns about maybe not qualifying because they do have a large MLU. That's a mean length. And so I would say with that, yes, you're right. They're going to have a lot of words, but then maybe use some data to really determine how they are using that to communicate, and then use other forms to show how they have some deficits in their communication and may require the services of a speech language pathologist. If Kathleen or Corey want to add to that, or after this is over, we can certainly chat more with those that have questions. But I will quickly go with the takeaways because you all know them already. If it will advance for me, let's see. There we go. GLP, again, we said it's not a diagnosis, not a treatment method, just provides a framework to understand language and development. And that echolalia, we've all talked about it. It does serve many communicative functions. I am old enough to remember IEPs and IFSPs that were written about extinguishing or reducing echolalia. And we realize that echolalia and scripting are valid and important forms of communication for all of our students, our autistic individuals, and our other children that we work with. So we also want you to remember that you don't need to be specially certified to begin practicing using these principles. Just use the information and the concepts behind all of this, and critically consider how you are providing therapy and assessment to your children. And just avoid repeating unproven claims as facts, and then keep our individual clients at the forefront of your minds, helping those families become detectives to determine what it is, helping your students move through phases so that everyone's aware and continues to progress. We do want to thank you so much for joining us, and we did include our emails and our phone number. So if you do have further questions, please feel free to reach out.
I want to take the opportunity to thank Kathleen, Christy, and Corey. This was a lot of information to pack in 1 hour. I've already said maybe you should come back for part 2. We'll see if that can happen, but we are so appreciative. And if we did not get to your question, again, their emails, and they are willing to have you email them directly. Let's see, whoever has the slides, if you can advance, I'm just going to do our quick wrap up. We do have a December Talks on Tuesday. Actually, that's not true. We do not have a December Talks on Tuesday, and we also will miss January. So our next Talks on Tuesday will be in February. I do not know the topic yet, but be watching for that. Probably as soon as you get off of this webinar, in your inbox will be the survey to complete. Once you complete that survey, you will have a certificate to download for professional development credit. I will stay on for another minute in case folks have any questions about the process of the Talks on Tuesday. And again, Seth, I am not sure, did you already drop the handout?
I have not in the chat. I can do that.
Okay, so we do have a handout that has a lot of this information and some of the strategies and definitions. So we will drop that in chat right now. So again, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you'll plan to join us in February for our next Talks on Tuesday. Have a good afternoon.